Hello everyone, and welcome back. Whether you're tuning in to learn, to relax, or maybe even to drift off into a peaceful nap, you're in exactly the right place. Today we're traveling deep into prehistory to uncover one of Earth's darkest and least known chapters, the very first plague to strike life on our planet. Long before cities, kings, or even written history, microscopic killers swept through early ecosystems, changing the course of evolution forever. This wasn't just a sickness of humans. We didn't even exist yet. It was a global biological disaster that struck primitive life itself. This isn't just a story. It's an educational journey into the deep past, where the tiniest organisms could collapse entire worlds. We'll explore how early life forms were devastated, how nature fought back, and how these ancient plagues shaped the world we inherited. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. We absolutely love seeing your messages. This channel exists because of you, and without you, these journeys into Earth's distant past would be impossible. And just one quick reminder, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. If you relax too much and drift off before the end, you might forget. Your support helps us share more peaceful, fascinating stories of human history. Now, let's go back billions of years to a world without animals, plants, or even oxygen in the air, and watch as Earth faced its first great microscopic enemy. 5,000 years ago, the world was alive with small but thriving human communities, scattered across forests, plains, and riversides. It was an age when farming had taken root, when villages dotted the landscape, and when humanity was just beginning to experiment with living in denser, more permanent settlements. These were people who carved tools from stone and bone, who stored grain in clay vessels, who raised livestock alongside fields of barley and wheat. They had rituals, beliefs, and traditions tied to the earth, the sky, and the spirits they believed surrounded them. Yet for all their knowledge of the seasons and the soil, they had no way of grasping the dangers that lurked in the microscopic world. Among these people, death was familiar, life expectancy was not long, and dangers lurked everywhere. A fall could lead to broken bones that never healed properly. A wound from hunting could fester. A harsh winter could bring famine. Yet what was happening around 3000 BC was different. Death was not coming to the very young or the very old, not to those weakened by hunger or hurt by war, but to men and women in their prime. They were the strong ones, the workers, the parents, the hunters and gatherers, who should have had years ahead of them. Their sudden collapse into illness must have seemed terrifying and inexplicable. Picture one small settlement near a river in what is now Latvia. Families live in simple wooden structures, their floors covered with animal hides, their fires glowing in the center for warmth and cooking. The days are busy with tending goats, grinding grain, weaving, and repairing tools. Children play outside, imitating the tasks of their parents, while elders tell stories of ancestors and gods. Into this peaceful rhythm comes disruption. One of the young men grows ill. At first it is small, perhaps a fever, perhaps fatigue, but soon he cannot rise from his bedding. His breath grows heavy, his skin flushes, and his strength drains away. His family gathers, offering herbs, water, and prayers. Nothing helps. In just a few days he dies, leaving his loved ones stunned. In another land far to the north, in Sweden, the same story unfolds. A young woman, healthy and full of life, suddenly weakens. She had been gathering berries just days before, laughing with her companions, preparing for the harvest. Now she coughs violently, her body racked with pain. She struggles to breathe, and no ritual or remedy seems to ease her suffering. Within a short time, she too is gone. Her family buries her with care, laying her body in the earth with ornaments and tools, the way their ancestors had always done. Yet in their hearts, they must have wondered why death had come so suddenly. What ties these stories together is not coincidence, but a hidden killer. Archaeologists, thousands of years later, would uncover the bones of people like this man and woman. In their teeth and skulls, traces of DNA revealed the culprit, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague. Long before it would devastate medieval Europe, before it would sweep through the Byzantine Empire, it was already silently moving through human populations, leaving grief and fear in its wake. The discovery reshaped how scientists understood this ancient disease. For years it was believed that plague only became dangerous during the Middle Ages, after it had evolved into a more virulent form. But these early skeletons proved otherwise. The plague had been present, and it had been deadly, thousands of years earlier. The deaths of these seemingly healthy young adults were not isolated mysteries, but part of a much broader story, one of the earliest known pandemics in human history. For the people of that time, explanations would have been sought in the spiritual realm. Without knowledge of microbes, they may have believed the sickness was caused by spirits, by angry ancestors, or by displeased gods. Shamans might have been called to perform rituals, smoke herbs, or chant prayers, but nothing would stop the steady hand of death. Each loss would have shaken the community's sense of order, creating both sorrow and fear, and as more people fell ill, whispers of a curse or an unseen evil likely spread. In small villages, the death of even one young adult could disrupt the entire balance of life. Families depended on each other. If a father died, his children might struggle to survive. If a mother was lost, her skills in food preparation, child-rearing, and community ties vanished with her. If multiple members of the same family succumbed, the survival of the entire household was threatened, and in many cases, this is exactly what happened. Archaeological evidence shows not only individual victims but groups, families buried together, victims clustered in ways that speak of shared suffering. Imagine the scene of such a burial, a shallow pit dug into the earth, lined with stone or wood, several bodies placed inside, their hands folded, their possessions beside them. There is no time to mourn each death individually. The living are too burdened, too frightened, too exhausted. Perhaps they rush the burials, fearing the sickness could linger around the corpses. Perhaps they burn homes after a family dies, an attempt to cleanse the space of unseen evil. Such acts have been found in the archaeological record: settlements abandoned, structures deliberately destroyed by fire, as though survivors were trying to prevent something from escaping. The young man in Latvia and the young woman in Sweden are just two examples, but they represent countless others across Eurasia. In their bones, scientists find not only proof of plague, but also the beginning of a mystery. How did it spread so far, and why did it strike when it did? These were not bustling cities with trade caravans and ships moving goods across continents. These were farming communities, small and scattered, yet the disease managed to move, reaching across hundreds of miles. Some may have carried it unknowingly as they traveled for trade, marriage, or migration. Some may have brought it with grain stores that attracted rodents, the silent killers of the bacteria. Others may have spread it directly, through coughing, through breath, in ways that remind us of more recent pandemics. What is chilling is how invisible it all was. To the people of that era, there was no sense of contagion as we know it today. They did not understand that one person could pass the illness to another simply by being near them. They would have cared for their sick, sat beside them, held their hands, breathed the same air, and in doing so invited the same fate upon themselves. Love and care became pathways of transmission, turning compassion into tragedy. The deaths of these early plague victims were not merely isolated tragedies, they were threads in a larger unraveling. Around this time, entire regions began to see population decline. Archaeological surveys reveal that settlements once thriving became empty. Fields once tilled were abandoned. Megaliths once raised with communal effort stopped appearing. The plague may not have been the only cause. Climate changes, famine, and violence also played roles, but its presence was undeniable. It was a silent factor eroding the strength of communities, one grave at a time. For us today, their story is both haunting and strangely intimate. The plague feels like an ancient enemy we know well, thanks to its later rampages. But here, in these first victims, we see its opening act. We see how it began, not with empires or armies, but with young people in small villages, suddenly cut down without warning. Their deaths ripple forward in time, their DNA telling us of a battle humans did not even know they were fighting. These early victims remind us of something profound. Disease has always been a part of the human story. Long before hospitals, long before scientific medicine, humanity lived under the shadow of illnesses they could not name. And yet, through each loss, through each wave of sickness, people endured. They buried their dead, mourned their losses, and continued to live. The young man in Latvia and the young woman in Sweden did not survive, but their communities did, and in their bones they left behind the first chapter of one of history's most enduring struggles. When scientists first began to suspect that an ancient plague might have stalked humanity thousands of years earlier than the medieval Black Death, the idea seemed almost too bold to believe. For centuries, the narrative of plague had been tethered to the great catastrophes of written history, those haunting episodes when cities fell silent, carts of corpses rolled through streets, and chroniclers scribbled desperate words about divine punishment and the wrath of God. To think that the very same killer had been present thousands of years earlier, before writing even began in much of Europe, required not just imagination but proof, and that proof came not from a dusty manuscript or a carved stone tablet, but from the smallest of places, the teeth and bones of the dead. Archaeology has always carried an element of detective work, but the discovery of plague's deep origins represents one of its most remarkable forensic triumphs. It began with skeletons, quiet remains buried in the soil for millennia. To the naked eye they revealed little. A femur could tell a researcher the height of a man. The wear on teeth could tell them what he ate. The curve of a spine could hint at his lifestyle, perhaps the strain of a farmer who bent to the soil each day. But hidden deep inside these bones, in the microscopic remnants of blood once coursing through veins, were fragments of DNA preserved like a secret waiting to be unlocked. At the turn of the 21st century, the technology of ancient DNA analysis began to change everything. Scientists realized they could extract genetic material from ancient remains and compare it to modern pathogens. This was revolutionary because DNA is fragile. Sunlight, water, bacteria, and time all conspire to destroy it. Yet under the right conditions, cold environments, dense bone structures like teeth, tiny fragments could survive for thousands of years. These fragments became time capsules, and inside them scientists found not just the story of the individuals who had died, but the story of the diseases that had once lived within them. When the first traces of Yersinia pestis were detected in ancient remains, it was like stumbling onto a familiar villain in a forgotten chapter of history. Scientists already knew this bacterium well. It had been identified in the late 19th century during outbreaks in Hong Kong by Alexandre Yersin, the Swiss-French bacteriologist, whose name it would carry forever. Yersin's discovery in 1894 was a milestone. For the first time, plague was not merely a curse, not merely a punishment or a shadow. It was a living organism, visible under the microscope, capable of being studied, named, and understood. His work revealed that the same plague which had killed millions in Europe centuries earlier was caused by a bacterium carried by fleas on rats, a microscopic agent that could leap from rodent to human with devastating speed. But when modern researchers found Yersinia pestis in skeletons from the Neolithic, it shifted the timeline of the bacterium's story back thousands of years. The plague, it turned out, was not a medieval invention. It had been with us almost since the dawn of agriculture. Teeth became the most reliable source of evidence. In the pulp of molars, scientists extracted ancient blood DNA. When sequenced, it revealed genetic markers unique to Yersinia pestis. At first, only a few skeletons showed these traces, but as more sites were tested, from Latvia to Sweden, from the Russian steppes to Central Europe, a pattern emerged. Plague had been present across vast regions, long before history had taken note. The identification of Yersinia pestis in such early remains sparked new debate. This was not the same plague that ravaged the Middle Ages. Genetic comparison showed that the ancient strain lacked some of the mutations that later made the bacterium especially efficient at spreading via fleas. In particular, the gene that allows Yersinia pestis to survive in the flea gut, turning the insect into a deadly vector, seemed to have evolved later. This raised questions. If the ancient bacterium was not yet flea-adapted, how did it spread? The answer remains debated, but one possibility is that pneumonic plague spread directly from person to person through droplets was the primary driver. If true, it would mean that these early outbreaks were intimate, spreading through families and close-knit groups, as people coughed, breathed, and cared for one another. The realization was sobering. Humanity's relationship with plague stretched back into the deep past, into times when people had no written words to describe their suffering, no priests to chronicle their prayers, no doctors to attempt cures. The skeletons told stories in silence, and DNA gave them voice. Each strand of bacterial code identified in ancient remains was a whisper from a world long gone, a reminder that this tiny bacterium had once stalked the earliest farmers and herders, just as it would later stalk kings and emperors. The detective story of plague's identification does not end with the mere detection of DNA. Scientists reconstructed ancient genomes of Yersinia pestis, effectively bringing the bacterium's evolutionary history into focus. By comparing sequences from different times and places, they built a family tree of plague. This genetic genealogy suggested that plague diverged from a close relative, Yersinia pseudotuberculosis, sometime between 7,000 and 6,000 years ago. The two bacteria were similar, but a handful of genetic changes gave Yersinia pestis its terrible new potential, where pseudotuberculosis caused relatively mild foodborne illness. Its descendant became one of the most lethal pathogens in human history. This evolutionary leap is one of the mysteries of biology, how a few genetic shifts can change the destiny of a microbe, and with it, the destiny of an entire species. The ancient DNA findings placed the emergence of plague squarely in the Neolithic, aligning eerily with the period known as the Neolithic decline, when human populations across Europe and Asia mysteriously collapsed. It is not definitive proof, but the timing is hard to ignore. The identification of plague in skeletons from this era transformed what had once been speculation into a plausible, chilling explanation. Consider the profound implication. For thousands of years, humans had lived with a deadly bacterium without ever writing its name, without even imagining its existence. Every cough, every fever, every sudden death was attributed to fate, spirits, or curse. Yet, buried inside the bones of those victims was the truth, tiny sequences of DNA that would survive long enough for modern science to read them. When those sequences were finally revealed, they stitched together a hidden chapter of our species' past. There is something strangely poetic about it. Alexander Yersin, standing in Hong Kong in 1894, gazing through his microscope at the tiny rods of Yersinia pestis, could not have known that his bacterium's story stretched back into the Stone Age. He identified the plague in its modern form, tied to rats and fleas, devastating crowded port cities. But hidden beneath the soil of Europe and Asia were older forms of the same enemy, waiting to be discovered. Science is cumulative, each generation adding pieces to the puzzle, and in this case, the puzzle extended far beyond the reach of written history. For modern readers, the identification of Yersinia pestis in ancient bones does more than rewrite timelines. It humanizes the victim. Suddenly, the young man in Latvia and the young woman in Sweden are not nameless skeletons, they are plague victims, part of the same tragic lineage as the millions who died in later centuries. Their deaths were not random or meaningless. They were part of the earliest recorded battle between humanity and one of its oldest microbial foes. The work of identifying plague in ancient remains also required extraordinary scientific rigor. Ancient DNA studies face constant challenges: contamination from modern bacteria, degradation over thousands of years, and the need to distinguish genuine ancient sequences from noise make every finding delicate. Researchers spend years refining methods, testing and retesting, verifying results before making claims. When the plague DNA was first announced in Neolithic skeletons, it was met with both excitement and skepticism. Could this truly be the same bacterium that killed millions centuries later? Could DNA survive that long in such fragile conditions? Yet, repeated studies across multiple sites confirmed the findings. Yersinia pestis was there. The story could no longer be ignored. There is a sense of awe in realizing how much the earth preserves. Teeth, bones, soil, all of these carry memories far beyond the human lifespan. When scientists extract DNA from a molar and identify the plague bacterium, they are bridging thousands of years in a single moment. They are listening to whispers of suffering from an age when no one could write or record, when only the dead themselves held the memory of what had killed them. And so, the identification of Yersinia pestis in these early victims does more than answer scientific questions. It changes our perception of history itself. Plague is no longer a medieval terror confined to textbooks about the 14th century. It is a thread that winds through the very origins of human settlement, shaping populations, influencing migrations, and perhaps even contributing to the mysterious declines that archaeology has long struggled to explain. For the communities who lived through it, the plague was unknowable. For us, it is now traceable, nameable, identifiable under the microscope and in the computer code of DNA. The distance between those ancient villagers and us is immense, yet the bacterium that felled them is the same one we still study today. In that continuity lies both terror and wonder, terror that such a tiny organism has haunted us for so long, and wonder that we now have the tools to finally see it clearly. The ground has always kept its secrets. Beneath the fields where crops sway in the wind, beneath the forests where animals roam, beneath the very soil that people once walked, traces of the past remain hidden. For centuries, archaeologists uncovered these traces in the form of pottery shards, stone tools, or skeletal remains. These artifacts offered glimpses of lives once lived, but for the longest time, the silent bones refused to tell the full story of what had ended those lives. It was only in recent decades, with the marriage of archaeology and genetics, that the dead themselves began to whisper the truth, and in those whispers came the shocking revelation that plague, the same plague that would later devastate medieval Europe, had been present in the Neolithic, carried silently in the teeth and bones of people who lived and died thousands of years before the invention of writing. The discovery was not immediate. Archaeology often begins with excavation, with careful brushes moving dirt away from fragile remains. In burial sites across Europe and Western Asia, researchers found skeletons dating back 5, even 6,000 years. Some graves contained single bodies carefully laid to rest. Others held entire families, interred together as though claimed by a shared fate. In a few haunting cases, mass graves revealed dozens of individuals buried hastily, suggesting deaths too numerous for communities to grieve in the usual way. For decades, these burials were mysterious but not unexpected. Death was a constant companion in the Neolithic world. What could not be seen was the real cause of so many of those deaths. The key lay in teeth. Human teeth, particularly the pulp sealed within molars, are extraordinary time capsules. Unlike other bones, teeth are dense and resilient, able to preserve microscopic traces of DNA long after flesh and marrow have vanished. Scientists realized that if pathogens had once circulated in the bloodstream of these ancient individuals, tiny fragments of their DNA might still linger in the dental pulp. And so, with tools far more delicate than those of earlier generations, researchers drilled into teeth and extracted powders that would later be processed in sterile laboratories designed to handle the fragile molecules of ancient DNA. At first, the results seemed almost unbelievable. Within the genetic sequences pulled from these remains, scientists detected fragments that matched Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for plague. In other words, the very same pathogen that had swept across Europe in the 14th century, killing perhaps half the population in some regions, was present thousands of years earlier in the bloodstreams of Neolithic farmers and herders. What had been speculation suddenly had evidence the plague was ancient, far older than history books had suggested. The evidence came from multiple sites, scattered across vast distances. In present-day Latvia, skeletons dating back around 5,000 years showed traces of the bacterium. In Sweden, more victims revealed the same DNA signature. Across Russia's steppe regions, in Central Europe, and even in the fringes of the Near East, similar findings emerged. Each discovery strengthened the case. This was not an isolated outbreak, not a local tragedy confined to one unlucky village. This was a widespread phenomenon. Plague DNA was appearing in the remains of people separated by geography, but united in suffering. These results were not just about identifying a pathogen, they also told a story about movement and connection. For plague DNA to appear in such distant places, the disease must have travelled, hitching rides with people, animals, or both. The Neolithic was a period of great change. Farming was expanding, trade networks were forming, with obsidian, salt and other goods moving across long distances. Communities that had once been small and scattered were becoming larger, creating mega settlements where thousands lived in close quarters. Grain storage attracted rodents, and rodents carried fleas. All the conditions were present for a disease to spread widely. The presence of plague DNA in remains across regions suggests that these early networks of contact were not just moving goods and ideas, but microbes as well. The genetic analysis also revealed something important. The ancient strains of Yersinia pestis were slightly different from those of the Middle Ages. They lacked some of the mutations that later made the bacterium especially deadly, such as the adaptation that allowed it to thrive in the gut of fleas. This meant that while the disease was certainly fatal in many cases, its mode of transmission may have been different. Instead of relying on fleas jumping from rats to humans, the early plague may have spread more directly, perhaps through pneumonic forms, where the bacteria infected the lungs and could pass from person to person via droplets. This would explain why entire families, buried together, sometimes showed signs of infection. They had not been bitten by the same flea. They had likely infected each other as they coughed and struggled to breathe in their final hours. Archaeological evidence adds another layer to the story. In some Neolithic settlements, houses appear to have been burned deliberately, not as accidents but as acts of cleansing. Entire structures, sometimes entire rows of dwellings, were destroyed by fire. Some archaeologists believe this may have been an attempt to halt the spread of disease. When whole families died, survivors may have feared that something inside the house carried a curse or a sickness. By burning the dwelling, they hoped to rid themselves of the unseen threat. Such actions are powerful hints that people recognized patterns of illness, even if they could not identify the cause. In other sites, mass graves tell their own grim tales. At one location, over 30 individuals were buried together, many of them related by blood. Genetic testing revealed that a significant percentage carried plague DNA. These were not random deaths, scattered over years. These were clustered tragedies, suggesting that the disease swept through communities with devastating speed. The comparison to later pandemics is unavoidable. The Black Death, for instance, often killed entire families in a matter of days. The Neolithic plague, while perhaps less infectious in its early form, still had the power to tear through households and leave behind pits of the dead. The sheer consistency of plague DNA across so many sites paints a picture of an epidemic that was not localized but continental in scale. Some studies suggest infection rates in certain populations reached as high as 17%, numbers comparable to later pandemics. While not all communities were affected equally, some sites show far lower rates of infection. The evidence indicates a broad pattern of devastation. This aligns with what archaeologists call the Neolithic decline, a mysterious period when populations across Europe dropped sharply, settlements were abandoned, and the cultural flourishing of earlier centuries slowed dramatically. Plague may not have been the only cause, but the genetic and archaeological evidence suggests it played a major role. There is also the haunting detail of time. In one family burial, the plague did not strike all at once. Instead, genetic analysis showed that the disease persisted over generations. Some skeletons from earlier layers carried the bacterium, while others buried decades later did as well. This indicated that plague returned in waves, echoing the patterns of pandemics throughout history. It was not a single outbreak that flared and vanished. It was a recurring presence, a shadow that lingered for over a century, claiming lives again and again. The identification of plague DNA in ancient remains has also reshaped how scientists understand human evolution. Some researchers suggest that the repeated exposure to such deadly diseases exerted selective pressure on human populations. In other words, those who survived may have passed on genetic traits that offered some protection against infection. This could explain certain patterns in modern immune systems, where remnants of ancient battles with pathogens are written into our very genes. The bones and teeth of Neolithic plague victims may not only tell us about the past, but also about why our bodies respond to infection the way they do today. Yet despite all the data, there remains a powerful human dimension to these discoveries. Each skeleton was once a living person, someone who laughed, worked, and dreamed in a world very different from ours. The DNA preserved in their teeth is not just a scientific sample, it is the final trace of a life cut short. When researchers announced that 17% of skeletons in a burial site carried plague, it is easy to focus on the number. But behind that percentage are individuals, mothers holding children, fathers taken in their prime, siblings buried side by side. The archaeological evidence, combined with the genetic proof, restores humanity to these ancient tragedies. The ground has always hidden the truth, but now it speaks more clearly than ever. In the silence of ancient burials, in the charred remains of abandoned homes, in the genetic code locked inside teeth, the story of the Neolithic plague emerges. It is a story of suffering, of mystery, and of the deep entanglement between humans and microbes. The genetic and archaeological evidence does not just confirm that plague was present, it shows how deeply it shaped the course of human history, long before anyone wrote the first word about it. The Neolithic world was alive with promise. Across Europe and Western Asia, fields stretched wider than ever before, villages blossomed into sprawling towns, and networks of exchange carried obsidian, salt and amber across vast distances. Farmers had transformed landscapes once ruled by forests into fertile zones of grain and pasture, and herders moved with cattle, sheep and goats that provided both food and wealth. It was a time when human beings seemed to have found the rhythm of settlement, anchoring themselves to the land in ways their ancestors could scarcely have imagined. Yet beneath this apparent prosperity, cracks began to spread. By the middle of the 4th millennium BC, the flourishing Neolithic world began to unravel. Populations that had grown steadily for centuries began to shrink. Great settlements that had once held thousands of people were suddenly abandoned. Archaeologists later gave this mysterious collapse a name, the Neolithic decline. For generations, the reasons for this decline puzzled researchers. Some suspected climate change, a slow shift in weather patterns that reduced yields and made farming less reliable. Others pointed to overexploitation of land, forests stripped for timber, soils exhausted by repeated planting, rivers strained by irrigation. Still others thought warfare might have played a role, as communities fought over dwindling resources. All these explanations had weight, and perhaps all contributed in some way. But in recent decades, another possibility has emerged, whispered from the teeth of the dead and confirmed by fragments of DNA. The Neolithic decline may have been tied to a silent killer, an invisible agent moving through populations at a speed and scale no one could have prepared for. The plague, Yersinia pestis, had already been identified in skeletons dating back to this period. Its presence alone was startling, but the timing was even more striking. The genetic evidence aligned almost eerily with the archaeological record of population collapse. Between roughly 3450 and 3000 BC, demographic studies show sharp declines across Europe. In settlement after settlement, archaeologists find signs of sudden abandonment. Large towns that once housed thousands dwindled into ghostly remains. In some cases, half-finished houses were left as if their builders had walked away mid-task. Storage pits were deserted with grain still inside. The silence of these sites speaks loudly. Something catastrophic had happened. To imagine life in these settlements is to picture communities that had grown confident in their way of life. In parts of what is now Ukraine, mega-settlements sprawled across the landscape, holding populations of 5,000 to 10,000 people, larger than many medieval towns that would rise thousands of years later. These were dense, bustling hubs of Neolithic innovation, with concentric layouts of houses and communal spaces. People here farmed collectively, traded goods, and shared traditions. But such density, once a sign of cultural achievement, was also dangerous. Crowded conditions meant that disease could spread like wildfire. With limited understanding of hygiene and no concept of microbes, people lived among refuse, with rodents thriving in grain stores and fleas multiplying unchecked. The plague found fertile ground in these environments. Families who once celebrated harvests together began to fall ill, their numbers dwindling in waves. The genetic traces left in their bones tell us that Yersinia pestis was there, silently making its way from one house to the next. In some cases, entire households were buried together, struck down within days of one another. Others reveal generations touched by the same pathogen, suggesting not just one outbreak, but repeated waves across decades. This continuity echoes what we know from later pandemics, where plague returned again and again, each time reshaping society. The collapse of populations did not happen evenly. Some regions were harder hit than others, with infection rates in certain areas climbing to catastrophic levels. Archaeologists estimate that in parts of Europe, up to half the population vanished within a century. In some areas, the decline was so dramatic that entire cultural traditions disappeared. Pottery styles that had once flourished ceased to be produced. Burial practices changed, with mass graves replacing individual burials. In others, violence seems to have erupted, with fortifications hastily built and skeletal remains showing signs of trauma. Whether these conflicts were sparked by fear, competition for resources, or attempts to keep outsiders away from infected areas, the result was the same: instability mounted, and societies crumbled. For the survivors, the world must have felt unpredictable and haunted. Imagine living in a settlement of several thousand, only to see neighbors collapse in sudden fevers, coughing blood, their bodies weakening within days. Imagine the fear that spread faster than the disease itself. Rumors of curses or angry spirits, whispers that entire families were being claimed by an unseen hand. Without knowledge of germs, people may have believed that houses themselves were tainted. Archaeological evidence of burned structures supports this view. Survivors torched homes of the dead, not out of cruelty but as desperate attempts to purify spaces they feared were cursed. The loss of life brought profound consequences. With fewer people to tend fields, agricultural output plummeted. Fields once carefully maintained became overgrown. Livestock, untended, may have wandered or died. Trade networks that had once tied communities together faltered as fear and depopulation broke links. The great mega-settlements, once beacons of Neolithic achievement, became shells, their once busy paths left to weeds and silence. By the turn of the 3rd millennium BC, many of these centers had been entirely abandoned. Where thousands once lived, only ruins remain. What makes this story even more poignant is that the Neolithic decline was not a uniform collapse into oblivion. Some groups endured, adapted, and even thrived in the aftermath. Populations shifted, new cultures emerged, and the Bronze Age eventually dawned, but the scars of the decline are etched in the archaeological record. Entire regions were depopulated for centuries. Ancient DNA studies confirm that genetic lineage had shifted dramatically as survivors intermingled with incoming populations from the Eurasian steppe. The plague may have acted not just as a killer, but as a catalyst, clearing space for new migrations and reshaping the very genetic map of Europe. Looking back, it is remarkable how closely the genetic and archaeological evidence now align. For years, the Neolithic decline was a puzzle without a key. Now, the teeth of the dead have provided one. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, lurking unseen for millennia, emerges as a prime suspect. It may not have been the sole cause. Climate shifts, soil exhaustion, and conflict surely played roles, but the suddenness and scale of the collapse fit the signature of a pandemic. Just as the Black Death transformed medieval Europe, the Neolithic plague may have altered the trajectory of prehistory. Yet even in the face of this tragedy, the resilience of human communities is evident. People rebuilt, moved, and adapted. They carried forward fragments of culture, knowledge of farming, traditions of pottery, and ritual, and above all, the determination to endure. The Neolithic decline reminds us that humanity has always lived in negotiation with unseen forces, that progress and collapse often walk side by side. It also offers a humbling perspective. Microbes have shaped our destiny for as long as we have been human, influencing where we live, how we organize, and even who survives to pass on their genes. The silence of the abandoned settlements, the mass graves filled hastily, the sudden disappearance of once thriving cultures, all these are the echoes of a collapse that remains partly mysterious, but deeply human. Thanks to archaeology and genetics, we can now place the plague at the heart of this great decline. What was once speculation is becoming story, told not in words carved on stone but in fragments of DNA hidden in the teeth of the long dead. It is a story of vulnerability, of fear, of resilience, and of transformation. And in understanding it, we recognize that the struggle against disease has always been one of the defining threads in the human story, stretching back not just centuries but thousands of years, to a time when the Neolithic world faltered under the shadow of an ancient plague. Across the vast plains of what we now call Ukraine and Moldova, enormous clusters of houses once rose from the earth like strange experiments in early urban life. These were not cities in the way we imagine later Mesopotamian or Egyptian centers, with temples, palaces, and rulers commanding from stone monuments. Instead, they were sprawling mega-settlements of the late Neolithic and Copper Age, built largely of wood and clay, arranged in great concentric circles that could stretch for miles. Some of them held 5,000, even 10,000 people, making them among the largest communities anywhere in the world at that time, rivaling the scale of early Sumerian city-states. To walk into such a settlement would have been to step into a human hive, a dense world of smoke and chatter, of animals bleating in pens, of children running down narrow lanes between houses pressed close together. At first glance, they would have seemed like triumphs of cooperation and ingenuity, monuments to humanity's ability to organize itself on a massive scale. But within these walls lay the very conditions that would allow one of history's deadliest pathogens to find a foothold. The people who built these mega-settlements were farmers and herders, descended from earlier Neolithic pioneers who had carried agriculture into Europe. Their lives were tied to the rhythms of the land, ploughing fields, harvesting grain, tending flocks of sheep, cattle and pigs. Yet, as their communities grew larger and larger, the very density that gave them strength also bred problems. Waste disposal was primitive at best. Animal pens sat close to living quarters, and piles of manure and rubbish accumulated quickly. Without proper sanitation systems, human waste often seeped into the soil, or ran along shallow ditches that could easily flood during rains, spreading contaminants. Water sources, though vital, were vulnerable to pollution, especially when thousands of people shared the same wells or riverside access. In such conditions, disease did not merely lurk in the background, it had fertile ground to flourish. Rodents, always eager companions of human settlements, thrived here. Grain stores offered endless supplies of food, and the thatched roofs and wooden beams of houses provided shelter. With rodents came fleas, and with fleas came the perfect transmission vehicle for Yersinia pestis. Archaeologists who have studied the remains of these settlements note the abundance of storage pits and granaries, essential for feeding such large populations. But each pit and each heap of harvested grain was also a beacon for rats. As the rodents gnawed through sacks and burrowed into piles, they multiplied, their populations swelling in lockstep with the human communities around them. To the people of the time, rats may have been nuisances, creatures scurrying at the edges of firelight, but to modern science they were the silent intermediaries of catastrophe. The scale of these settlements magnified the problem. In a small village of a few dozen families, an outbreak might burn itself out quickly, confined to one cluster of homes. But in settlements of thousands, with people living shoulder to shoulder, attending communal gatherings, sharing food and water, and moving frequently within the settlement, any infection could spread rapidly. Imagine a single infected flea biting one person, who then fell ill with fever, weakness, and swelling. His family cared for him, perhaps sleeping beside him on straw mats, unaware that fleas could jump from host to host. Soon his wife, children, and neighbors showed similar symptoms. Before long, the infection had touched dozens. In such density, weeks were all it took for hundreds to succumb. And when traders arrived from nearby villages or when herders moved livestock along paths that crossed through the settlement, the infection traveled outward, hitching rides on humans and animals alike. Archaeological evidence from these mega-settlements suggests that their very design unintentionally encouraged such spread. Many were arranged in circular patterns, with rows of houses forming concentric rings around central spaces. Paths ran between these rings, connecting homes but also acting as thoroughfares where people constantly mingled. Smoke from cooking fires hung heavy in the air, filling lungs already weakened by the close living quarters. Livestock added to the density, their manure piling high and drawing flies and vermin. With no formal waste removal, heaps of refuse became part of the landscape, and each heap a breeding ground for contagion. For centuries this way of life seemed sustainable, uncomfortable perhaps, but survivable. Yet when plague entered the equation, the balance tipped fatally. The tragedy of these settlements is that their very success created their vulnerability. They represent some of the earliest experiments in large-scale living, and the ambition behind them is striking. Coordinating thousands of people to build and maintain such vast communities required social cohesion, shared rituals, and complex systems of cooperation. They were centers of culture, where pottery styles flourished, where tools were crafted in abundance, where rituals and feasts must have filled communal spaces. But just as they concentrated human creativity, they also concentrated risk. The same gatherings that reinforced social bonds became vectors for disease. The same communal granaries that secured food supplies became magnets for rodents. The same density that allowed for vibrant interaction became the channel through which pathogens could race unimpeded. For the people living there, none of this would have been visible in the way it is to us now. Illness would have seemed mysterious, perhaps the work of spirits or angry ancestors. When families perished, explanations may have leaned on superstition. Archaeologists have found evidence that homes were sometimes burned, and it is tempting to imagine this as an act of desperation, a way to destroy what was thought to be cursed. In reality, they may have been torching the very sites where disease vectors thrived. But without knowing the underlying cause, fires may have slowed outbreaks in some cases, but they could not stop the tide. In the end, the scale of death overwhelmed the ability of these communities to sustain themselves. Entire settlements were abandoned, their inhabitants gone, their houses collapsing into the earth. And yet, their story did not vanish completely. From the soil, archaeologists have uncovered bones that still carry the genetic fingerprints of plague. From post holes and ditches, they have traced the outlines of the settlements, revealing the sheer size and ambition of these proto-urban worlds. Through these discoveries, we can reconstruct the conditions that allowed Yersinia pestis to spread so effectively: dense populations, poor sanitation, rodent infestations, and an utter lack of medical defenses. What emerges is a portrait both tragic and profoundly human. People sought to build better lives by coming together, and in doing so, they created the conditions for one of humanity's earliest great epidemics. The paradox of progress, its capacity to nurture and destroy at once, echoes from these ancient mega-settlements to the crowded cities of our own time. When archaeologists first uncovered the long, shallow trenches in parts of Central and Eastern Europe, they knew immediately that something unusual had taken place thousands of years ago. These were not the careful, ritualized burials that marked much of the Neolithic period, where families interred their dead in small groups, adorned with ornaments, tools, or pottery. Instead, the soil revealed haphazard layers of bones, entire families laid one upon another, children nestled against mothers, elders pressed beside young men who might once have been their sons. The impression was not of peace, but of urgency. Live extinguished quickly, bodies buried without ceremony, communities desperate to dispose of the dead before sickness spread further. Each skeleton told part of a story, and together they painted the haunting picture of mass death. For modern scientists, these graves became more than archaeological puzzles. They were archives of catastrophe, holding within their teeth and bones traces of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that caused one of humanity's earliest known plagues. When genetic testing confirmed its presence, the mystery of why so many were buried together in such haste came into sharper focus. These were not victims of war or famine, at least not primarily. They were casualties of an invisible enemy that could sweep through entire households within days. The clustering of family members in the same grave suggests a cruel pattern, infections spreading from parent to child, from sibling to sibling, sparing none. For every family that once laughed, ate, and worked together, there were now remains that testified to a shared and sudden silence. The tragedy of these outbreaks was compounded by their scale. Infection rates appear to have been staggeringly high, enough to overwhelm entire settlements. Imagine a household of 6 or 7, struck by fever within the same week. A father collapses first, shivering and delirious, while his wife tends to him. Days later, she too develops weakness, her lymph nodes swelling painfully in the groin and armpits. Children, clinging to their parents, soon begin to cough and sweat. The eldest tries to fetch water, but falters halfway, dizzy and gasping. Within a fortnight, most of the family has died, leaving neighbors horrified but also vulnerable. For in caring for one another, they passed the sickness along. What began in one house quickly radiated outward, engulfing an entire neighborhood and then the wider settlement. Some of the remains show signs that point to pneumonic plague, the deadliest form of Yersinia pestis infection. Unlike the bubonic form, carried primarily by fleas from rodents, pneumonic plague spread directly from human to human through respiratory droplets. A single cough could seed the disease in those standing nearby. In the cramped and smoky interiors of Neolithic houses, where families gathered around hearths to cook and sleep, this form of transmission was devastating. Once established, pneumonic plague moved at terrifying speed. Victims could succumb within 2 or 3 days, and those exposed were often doomed before they even realized what gripped their lungs. Entire lineages could vanish in a matter of weeks, their legacy reduced to a jumbled layer in a communal grave. The emotional dimension of such loss is impossible to reconstruct fully. Yet hints remain. The hurried burials suggest fear of contamination, fear of lingering among the dead. But they also suggest desperation. In some graves we see that infants were placed in the arms of adults, as if even in death, the bond of family could not be broken. Perhaps these were gestures of love by survivors who managed to dig the graves, or perhaps entire households were carried out together, arranged by the few neighbors still standing. Either way, the tenderness of placement contrasts sharply with the violence of the disease that cut lives short. It reminds us that these were not anonymous skeletons but mothers, fathers, children, entire webs of relationships unraveled in an instant. The ripple effects must have been immense. With so many adults lost, children were left without caretakers, villages without leader. Skills that sustained communities, farming knowledge, tool making, food storage, was suddenly endangered when entire families disappeared. Crops may have withered in the fields for lack of hands to harvest them. Livestock, once carefully tended, may have wandered untended, becoming prey for wolves or carriers of further disease. The loss of each family was not merely personal, it was societal, tearing holes in the fabric of community life that could not be mended easily. Archaeological finds reinforce this impression. In some regions, settlements show signs of abrupt abandonment. Houses that once busted with activity collapsed into ruins, their roofs caving in, walls eroding, tools left behind. It is not hard to imagine survivors fleeing these ghost villages, traumatized by what they had witnessed, carrying with them both memories of loss and possibly the disease itself. In their wake, mass graves stood as mute witnesses to the scale of tragedy, silent archives of suffering that only modern science would eventually decode. The haunting part is how multi-generational these tragedies often were. Skeletons of grandparents have been found alongside those infants, 3 or even 4 generations in the same grave. This pattern suggests that once plague entered a household, it did not discriminate. The wisdom of age offered no protection, nor did the innocence of childhood. Whole bloodlines could be extinguished in a single outbreak, erasing family histories that had stretched back centuries. When genetic testing reveals the bacterium's presence in both young and old within the same burial, it confirms what the arrangement of bones already whispers, that the plague moved ruthlessly through every layer of society. This was not an isolated phenomenon. Across regions from the Baltic to the Eurasian steppe, similar burial patterns emerge. The recurrence of mass graves from this era suggests that these outbreaks were not rare flukes, but part of a recurring cycle of devastation. Each outbreak must have left scars, reshaping how people thought about life, death, and perhaps even the unseen forces they believed governed their world. If entire households could vanish overnight, what security could anyone truly have? It is possible that such traumas eroded confidence in the mega-settlements themselves, fueling the broader Neolithic decline. For people already grappling with resource pressures and social tensions, the plague's toll may have been the breaking point. Even as we examine these graves with the detachment of science, their human dimension is inescapable. We picture a mother cradling her child as both succumbed to fever. We picture a neighbor, exhausted and terrified, dragging bodies to a pit by torchlight. We picture elders, once revered for their memory and guidance, reduced to silent bones beside the young they could not protect. Each scene belongs not just to the distant past, but to a shared human story of vulnerability. For all our advances, we recognize echoes of later tragedies. The Black Death of the 14th century, the Spanish flu of the 20th, and even modern pandemics that remind us how quickly liminal life can unravel. What lingers most from these Neolithic mass graves is the sense of families undone, love and kinship broken by something no one could see or understand. The people who laid their loved ones to rest could not know that inside the bodies they buried lived a bacterium, that would haunt humanity for millennia. They could not know that their tragedy was part of a pattern that would repeat again and again in history. All they knew was grief, and all they could do was bury it in the earth, hoping perhaps that by covering the bodies they could cover the sorrow as well. But the sorrow remains, unearthed centuries later, reminding us of the fragility of human life when confronted with nature's most ruthless designs. The first wave of infection may not have been recognized as something entirely new. To the communities of Neolithic Europe, sickness was an expected part of life. Children often fell ill, elders weakened quickly, and deaths in small numbers rarely surprised anyone. But when the first true plague wave began its quiet spread, it likely seemed at first like an especially cruel season, perhaps the work of foul spirits or a sign that the gods had grown restless. Villages buried more of their own than usual, and shallow graves began to multiply at the edges of settlements. Still, there was no reason to think the world had changed forever. Survivors mourned, rebuilt their homes, and tilled their fields once more. The first wave was harsh, but it was survivable, and people carried forward, unaware that this was only the beginning of a longer ordeal. Genetic traces of Yersinia pestis found in individuals from this period suggest that the earlier strain was less aggressive, not yet fully adapted to the efficient transmission mechanisms it would later acquire. It may have lingered mostly in rodent populations, spilling over into humans only sporadically. This made the disease uneven, striking one community while sparing another, devastating one household while leaving a neighbor untouched. To those who lived through it, the experience must have felt arbitrary, like a roll of fate's dice. Stories would have spread of villages where whole families perished, while only a short walk away, others survived with hardly a cough. Such randomness must have planted seeds of unease. But when the outbreak faded, there was relief and perhaps even hope that the worst had passed. But the plague had not passed. It had only begun its long apprenticeship in human misery. The second wave, arriving decades later, carried with it refinements of lethality. Genetic studies suggest that by this time, Yersinia pestis had acquired traits that made flea-borne transmission more efficient, allowing the disease to leapfrog through rodent populations and erupt into human settlements with greater speed. Now, when a community began to sicken, the deaths were more clustered, the patterns more alarming. Families who cared for the ill fell sick in turn, and the graves from this period show higher concentrations of multiple individuals interred at once. Archaeologists find evidence of hurried burials, bodies placed together without ceremony, as if the living could not spare the time to honor their dead properly. The sense of urgency speaks to fear, to a recognition that the sickness could spread faster than they could dig. Life between the first and second waves might have seemed deceptively stable. Populations grew again, settlements expanded, children were born into a world their parents hoped would be safe. Yet in the shadows, the bacterium endured, hidden in burrows and fields, waiting. When it re-emerged, it struck not only harder but more broadly, catching communities that may have thought themselves immune after the first brush with disease. Imagine the shock of survivors of the first wave, who had come to believe that whatever invisible force had taken their neighbors had somehow spared them. Now, decades later, they watched as their own children and grandchildren collapsed, coughing blood or burning with fever. The trauma of the second wave was therefore deeper, for it destroyed not only lives but also illusions. The spread of the second wave coincided with a period of dense settlement in parts of Europe. Megasites that had once been symbols of human achievement, villages of thousands where people lived in close quarters, were now perfect breeding grounds for the plague. Rodents thrived in the refuse of human life, and fleas carried their infected blood from creature to creature, human to human. With little understanding of contagion, people did what they always did. They cared for one another, they sat beside the sick, they fed them, they held them, and in doing so they passed the bacterium hand to hand, breath to breath. The intimacy of love became the very channel through which death spread. If the second wave was devastating, the third was apocalyptic. By now, Yersinia pestis had become something more dangerous still. Genetic evidence indicates the emergence of the form capable of pneumonic transmission, where the disease leapt from lungs to lungs through droplets in the air. This mutation transformed the plague from a localized killer into a force capable of mowing down entire households within days. In the dim interiors of Neolithic homes, smoke-filled and poorly ventilated, the The cough of one infected person became a death sentence for those nearby. Where earlier outbreaks had unfolded over weeks, the third wave moved in days, cutting through villages like wildfire through dry grass. For survivors of the earlier waves, the third must have felt like a curse beyond reason. To live through one devastating outbreak might be bearable. To endure two was tragic, but to face a third fiercer than either before was to confront hopelessness itself. A grandparent who had watched their own parents die in the first wave and lost children in the second might now see the third consume grandchildren before their eyes. What was left to believe in after such cycles of grief? Stories must have shifted from mourning to resignation, from prayers for healing to whispered acceptance that nothing could stop the plague once it arrived. Archaeological traces from this time show an increase in abandoned settlements, suggesting that people fled in terror, hoping to outrun the invisible enemy. But flight often brought the disease with them, carrying fleas in clothing, or the bacterium already incubating in their bodies. In this way, the waves not only destroyed communities but reshaped landscapes, leaving behind ghost villages and empty fields. Paths once trodden by traders and travelers grew silent, while elsewhere, new groups migrated into the vacuum left by the dying. The plague was not only a biological event but a cultural and demographic turning point, scattering populations and redrawing human maps across regions. The cumulative effect of these three waves was staggering. Over a span of a century and more, generations were defined not by growth and continuity but by rupture. Each wave carved away at populations, leaving fewer to carry forward traditions, languages, and skills. The intergenerational trauma must have been profound. Children raised in the aftermath of one wave would have grown up on stories of loss, only to live through the reality of the next. For them, plague was not an event but a condition of existence, a shadow always waiting at the edge of life. And yet, humanity endured. Even as waves returned with greater force, survivors clung to one another, rebuilt their homes, and sowed fields once more. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or perhaps it was simply the only choice available. To stop would have been to surrender entirely, and so life persisted, scarred but unbroken. It is this persistence, in the face of repeated catastrophe, that connects those distant ancestors to us. They did not understand microbes or mutations, but they understood love, and it was love that carried them through. Love for children, for partners, for community. That love meant caring for the sick, even at mortal risk, burying the dead even in fear, and trying again to live even after entire generations had been lost. The memory of the three waves, though unrecorded in writing, must have lingered in oral traditions, in stories told by firesides, in the wary habits of survivors who had learned to fear crowded places or strange coughs. The waves left not only bones in the ground, but imprints in human memory, shaping culture in ways that cannot be measured. What we know today through DNA and archaeology was, for them, lived as an unending cycle of dread and endurance, and though centuries have passed, the echoes of their struggle remain in our understanding of waves of infection, in our recognition that history's rhythms are sometimes cruelly repetitive, and in the sobering truth that humanity has always been shaped by the invisible hand of disease. When trying to grasp the scale of the first plague's mortality, the mind almost falters. Numbers alone cannot capture the weight of so many lives extinguished, nor the silence left behind in places where once there had been laughter, trade, and the rhythms of daily life. Yet even as the statistics remain uncertain, scattered across bones in the earth and the fragments of ancient DNA, one truth emerges with clarity. The plague of the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age claimed millions. It was not a brief catastrophe, nor a localized tragedy. It was a continental event, unfolding wave after wave, reshaping the human map of Eurasia. Its scale can only be compared to the later pandemics that history remembers more vividly. And even then, the ancient plague's quiet devastation may have equaled or even exceeded some of them, though it left no chronicles behind to tally its toll. Archaeologists piecing together the story have found entire settlements reduced to grave fields. In regions from the Baltic to the steppe, skeletons show signs of lives cut short abruptly, clustered in ways that suggest families and communities overwhelmed at once. Some sites contain multiple individuals buried together, not across decades but in hurried succession, as though a single week or month had ended entire households. When genetic sequencing reveals the unmistakable signature of Yersinia pestis within their teeth and bones, it confirms that these were not just ordinary deaths, not the random attrition of natural causes, but part of a much larger pattern. Each grave is a data point, each body a reminder of scale, but when placed together across regions, they speak of mortality that radiated far beyond what isolated discoveries can show. The comparisons with later pandemics help us glimpse what this must have meant. The Black Death of the 14th century, the most famous plague pandemic, is estimated to have killed as much as half of Europe's population, tens of millions in a matter of a few years. The Justinian plague in the 6th century, too, may have carried away a quarter of the Mediterranean world's inhabitants. And yet, the plague of 5,000 years ago, though it unfolded over more than a century rather than a few seasons, may well have rivaled these later cataclysms in total numbers. It swept through a world that was smaller in population but far more vulnerable, where medical understanding was non-existent, and survival rested on fragile social bonds. If millions died in that world, the percentage of humanity lost was staggering, and the unevenness of its toll created scars that archaeology still records in abandoned villages, in collapsed farming systems, and in shifting genetic lineages across Europe and Asia. The mortality was not uniform, however. One of the most striking aspects of the plague's first great pandemic is the way it carved its path unevenly across the landscape. Some regions appear to have been devastated, their populations dwindling almost to disappearance, while others seem to have been touched more lightly or spared altogether. Climate, geography, and the movement of people all played their part. Dense settlements, especially the megasites of Eastern Europe, became crucibles of infection, their crowded homes and heaps of refuse feeding both rodents and fleas. These communities, once vibrant centers of innovation, collapsed almost entirely, leaving behind ghost cities in the archaeological record. Yet in more remote or scattered settlements, survival was higher, as distance itself provided a buffer against contagion. The unevenness meant that some cultures vanished, while others endured and expanded into the empty spaces, creating a demographic reshuffling that changed the course of prehistory. To imagine the lived experience of such mortality is to envision a world where the rhythm of death outpaced the rhythm of life. In one generation, a village might lose half its people, in another, 2/3, families fractured, children orphaned, elders left without caretaker. Women who survived saw their communities' birth rates collapse under the pressure of repeated loss, while men who survived carried their bloodlines into new unions, altering the genetic map of Europe in ways scientists still trace today. In some regions, whole maternal lineages vanish from the record after this period, suggesting that women bore the brunt of mortality or social disruption. This is what scale means. Not just numbers, but the erasure of voices, the disappearance of lineages, the silencing of entire traditions of song, story, and memory. Unlike later pandemics, this one left no written accounts of its horror. There are no chronicles describing wagons of the dead, no letters lamenting the silence of the streets. Instead, the evidence lies buried, waiting thousands of years for scientists to rediscover it. And yet, in its silence, the plague scale speaks all the louder. Entire cultures decline abruptly in the archaeological record around 3000 BC, their monumental settlements deserted, their pottery styles fading, their trade networks broken. Such collapses are not explained by war or famine alone. They point to mortality on such a scale that societies could no longer reproduce themselves, no longer maintain the basic structures of life. The plague did not simply kill individuals, it dismantled the fabric of whole communities. The comparison with later pandemics also reveals something more haunting. The Black Death and the Justinian plague came in a world with written language, with religion and art capable of expressing grief, with state systems that attempted, however poorly, to respond. But 5,000 years ago, humanity was still largely village-bound, without written words to record loss, without centralized states to organize relief. The pandemic's scale unfolded in silence, unmarked by contemporary testimony. And perhaps it was worse for this grief without expression, catastrophe without record, a disaster whose victims could not even cry out across history to be remembered. It is only now, with the recovery of plague DNA from their bones, that their voices are faintly heard again, telling us in molecular whispers of a pandemic that reshaped the human story. The uneven regional impact also meant that mortality reshaped the balance of power among groups. In Eastern Europe, the great farming cultures that had thrived for centuries collapsed in the face of death. Their mega-settlements, left as empty shells, into this vacuum moved pastoralist groups from the steppe, whose mobility and smaller population density made them more resilient to plague's reach. The great migration of steppe peoples into Europe coincides closely with the timing of the pandemic, and many scholars now argue that the scale of mortality among Europe's farmers opened the door for this demographic shift. In this way, the plague's toll was not only measured in lives lost, but in the reconfiguration of cultural dominance. Those who survived inherited a world newly emptied of competitors, where fields lay fallow and homes stood abandoned, waiting to be claimed. This too is part of understanding scale. Mortality is not only about numbers, but about opportunity, about how death reshapes life for those who remain. The survivors of the plague waves became the ancestors of much of modern Europe, not only because they endured, but because others did not. The unevenness of mortality created new landscapes for survival, where migration, adaptation, and cultural transformation followed directly in the wake of catastrophic loss. The pandemic was both an end and a beginning, and the scale of its mortality was the chisel that carved this transition into history. And yet, even as we acknowledge the millions lost, it is vital to remember that behind every number was a face, a name, a story. The woman buried with her child in a hurried grave in Latvia, both testing positive for plague DNA, represents not statistics but the intimate pain of a family undone. The community in Eastern Europe that buried 20 in one grave, their bodies aligned in a rush of mourning, tells us of neighbors weeping, of survivors straining to keep up with the endless work of death. The scale of mortality is measured in vastness, yes, but also in the closeness of grief, in the daily heartbreak of one family after another, stretched across a continent for more than a century. When archaeologists first began uncovering the deserted settlements of the late Neolithic, they were faced with a puzzle that has taken decades to piece together. The scale of the collapse was undeniable. Whole regions once thriving with large communities suddenly lay silent, their houses amazons, their fields overtaken by weeds, their once bustling trade routes fading into obscurity. What made it all the more perplexing was that the decline seemed to occur almost everywhere at once. Around the middle of the 4th millennium BC, from Central Europe to the edges of the Eurasian steppe, there was no single smoking gun. Instead, a chorus of possibilities emerged, each plausible in its own way, each supported by some evidence, and each weaving together into a story of collapse that was not simple but layered, a mosaic of catastrophe. One of the earliest explanations leaned heavily on warfare. Archaeologists found skeletons with arrow wounds, skulls crushed by blunt force, and mass graves where bodies were piled without the careful rituals of ordinary burial. Such discoveries painted a picture of violent conflict, of communities torn apart by raids, or perhaps even larger-scale battles. The late Neolithic was, after all, a time of great change. New weapons were being fashioned from stone, and the bow and arrow, already long in use, seemed to appear with new frequency in grave goods. The walls of certain settlements hinted at defensive fortification. To some scholars, the evidence suggested that these societies had turned upon one another, their decline driven less by invisible pathogens and more by visible blades. Warfare, in this view, was both the cause and the symptom of a world unraveling, populations strained by scarcity or envy attacking one another until the social fabric itself dissolved. And yet, even as warfare left undeniable marks in the archaeological record, it could not fully explain the scale or the speed of the decline. Battles killed dozens, perhaps hundreds, but not the millions implied by the sheer number of abandoned villages. Raids might devastate a region, but they do not leave behind the silent footprints of entire cultures disappearing. The violence, though real, seemed more like an echo of something larger, a symptom rather than the root cause. Still, the idea lingered, because violence is visible, tangible, and easy to imagine. It offers a narrative of human agency. Societies fell because humans themselves brought ruin with their own hands. Others turned their attention to fear, not of arrows or axes, but of something more insidious. Imagine a settlement where people suddenly begin dying in quick succession, fathers, mothers, children collapsing with fever and weakness, the air itself feeling cursed. Survivors, gripped by terror, might abandon their homes, believing the very earth or air to be poisoned. Whole communities could scatter not because of conquest, but because of dread, leaving behind empty houses in their desperate flight. Fear then became another possible explanation. It is not always the plague itself that empties a settlement, but the panic it spreads. When archaeologists encounter places where homes seem to have been deserted hastily, with tools left in corners and food still stored in pits, they see traces of a sudden flight, as though people walked away mid-breath and never came back. Fear has no bones to leave behind, but it has echoes in the way settlements appear frozen in time. A different thread of explanation points toward the land itself. By the late Neolithic, agriculture had transformed human life. Communities no longer relied solely on hunting and gathering. They tilled fields, sowed crops, and depended on harvests that came with both promise and risk. Archaeologists studying ancient pollen samples and soil layers found signs that the land was beginning to suffer. Over-farming, deforestation, and soil exhaustion may have weakened agricultural systems, leaving populations vulnerable to famine. Climate shifts too played their role. Subtle changes in rainfall patterns, colder seasons, or prolonged droughts. When the harvests failed, hunger would follow, and with hunger came susceptibility to disease and social unrest. It is easy to imagine communities already strained by scarcity turning inward, hoarding resources or fighting over what little remained. In this sense, agricultural failure was both a direct killer, through famine, and an indirect one through the collapse of trust and solidarity. Into this landscape of uncertainty entered the evidence for plague. When scientists first detected Yersinia pestis DNA in the remains of individuals from the Neolithic, the puzzle shifted dramatically. Suddenly, there was a new player in the debate, one capable of explaining mortality on the scale observed, one that needed no fortresses or famines to spread devastation. The bacterium, carried by fleas and rodents, could move invisibly, jumping from person to person, household to household, community to community. Unlike warfare, which kills selectively, plague kills indiscriminately, young and old, strong and weak alike. Unlike famine, which leaves skeletal traces of malnutrition, plague leaves little but sudden absence, a vanishing of life that archaeology alone cannot fully capture. The discovery of plague DNA did not erase the other explanations, but it added a powerful dimension to the story. The debates then are less about choosing one cause over another, and more about weighing how they intertwined. Warfare may have flared more intensely in regions already weakened by plague or famine. Fear may have been amplified by the sight of unexplained illness, driving survivors from their homes even if they were not yet infected. Agricultural failure may have reduced immunity, making populations more susceptible to infection, while simultaneously sparking conflict over dwindling resources. In this light, the decline of the late Neolithic world was not the work of a single villain, but of a convergence of pressures, each compounding the other, until societies buckled under the weight. The story becomes even more complex when we consider the unevenness of the decline. In some regions, agriculture seemed to recover swiftly, settlements persisted, and life continued. In others, entire cultural traditions vanished. This patchwork survival hints that local conditions matter deeply. A settlement with more resilient soils or access to diverse food sources might weather a famine better. A community more isolated might escape the worst of the plague. Groups with stronger defenses might repel raiders more effectively. Each variable mattered, and each contributed to whether a society endured or dissolved. The debates among scholars mirror the debates that must have played out among survivors themselves long ago as they tried to make sense of why their neighbors died while they lived, why one valley lay silent while another remained populated. What emerges from these debates is less a single answer than a lesson in fragility. The late Neolithic world was one of great achievement, large settlements, complex trade networks, flourishing agriculture, but it was also a world balanced precariously. Vulnerable shocks that today might seem manageable but then could prove fatal. Plague, warfare, fear and famine were not separate threats, but strands of a rope that tightened together around human communities. To imagine the decline is to imagine people living through overlapping crises, each compounding the other, each eroding the stability of life until there was nothing left but collapse. And perhaps that is why the debates continue today. The story of the Neolithic decline is not just about the past, it is also about us. We too live in a world where disease, conflict, fear, and environmental strain intersect. We too wonder which threat will prove most decisive. By studying the echoes of decline 5,000 years ago, scholars are not only reconstructing the past, but also holding up a mirror to the present, reminding us how easily civilizations can stumble when too many burdens fall at once.